Welcome back, everybody. In this video, I am going to show you my quickest win in a classical chess game. This was an 18-move game. It was action-packed, and I delivered a really cool checkmate in the end. So let's jump into it. This game was round one of a tournament that I'm playing at the Marshall Chess Club. You'll see my opponent had the black pieces, and he's about 1200 USCF. So I started out with d4, and my opponent played f5. This is the Dutch defense. I do not know the Dutch defense very well. I'll be the first to admit that, but I do have my opening setup against it. So I went g3. I was going to fianchetto this light squared bishop and move from there. Here my opponent played d5, so he's really anchoring down on this e4 square, really controlling it. Doesn't really change my plans though. So I played bishop g2, fianchetto the light squared bishop, and here my opponent played c6, which creates this pawn chain against the bishop. So now I played knight f3, just another simple developing move, nothing crazy here. And my opponent plays knight d7. I guess he wants to control this e5 square and stop me from putting my knight there so easily. So now I castled, again, simple development, nothing crazy. And here my opponent played h6, which was a little bit of a strange move, but I understand the reasoning. The reason that my opponent played h6 is that he wants to control this g5 square. He's worried that if I play knight g5 myself, then I'll be able to play knight e6, and I'll fork the queen and the bishop. Now, practically, this actually isn't an issue. If he were just to develop his knight, and now I play knight g5, he can play knight b6. The e6 square is defended by the bishop, and this actually doesn't cause any issues for him. So I think this is the reason why he played h6 himself. Now, the problem with this move is that h6 leaves these light squares super vulnerable. Black has already played f5. Now with h6 also, these light squares are very weak. So I immediately played knight h4 here. This attacks the pawn on f5, but it also threatens knight g6, which is going to fork the bishop and the rook. Black's best move here would have been to play knight d to f6. This reveals the bishop's defense of the f5 pawn. And additionally, this knight on f6 covers the h5 square, which you'll see is very key. Instead, my opponent played e6 to defend this pawn. And now I went full attack. I'm castled, my opponent isn't, so I'm just going to try to shred open the center. So here I play e4. Now the real idea here is that we want to reveal the queen's control of the h5 square. If we can get our queen to h5 with check, after the king moves, let's say if the king moves to e7, then we have this fork with the knight, which is going to hit the king and the rook, and we're going to win the rook there. So my opponent here takes the pawn, and now I play queen h5 check. The best move in this position would be to play g6 to block. And here, if I take with the knight, preparing this discovery check against the king, and we're also attacking the bishop and the rook, then my opponent has this annoying move, knight g to f6, which attacks our queen. We have to tuck our queen away to e2 probably, and this is not as much of an attacking position as we want. We're not getting as much out of this position. Instead, if I take with the queen, then after king e7, there really aren't many other checks. I can drop the queen back to h5, and we can threaten knight g6, which again would fork the king and the rook. But now my opponent, again, can bring the knight out to f6. I've got to tuck the queen away. We're not getting as much out of the attack as we want to, which is why g6 is the best move. Instead, my opponent just played king e7 right away, and now I played knight g6 check. We're forking the king. We're also attacking the rook. Here, my opponent played king d6. Now, I could have just taken the rook. That would have been totally fine, but instead I decided to activate another piece, get another piece in the game, and also make sure that we can keep this king in very vulnerable positions. So I played bishop f4 check. The king might have an idea to try to escape this way. So if I play bishop f4 check, we can drive the king out into the center and we can open up even more lines of attack. So here my opponent played e5. I took that pawn with check, and after knight takes e5, I played rook d1 check. We are skewering the king, and the queen is right behind, so we can win the queen right after. In this position, my opponent played king c7. This was the only available square to keep connection between the king and the queen. And notice there are a lot of winning moves here. The rook is hanging on h8. I can also take the queen on d8, but I decided to play bishop takes e5 check first. I thought, you know what, let's take with check first, and then afterwards we can worry about the hanging pieces. So here my opponent played bishop d6, and again, I take a piece with check. Now, the best move for black here is just to sack the queen. I'll take back, and then you can take, you're giving up some material, but it's better than the alternative, which is to play king b6. Now this is really just turned into a king hunt. The black king is extremely, extremely exposed in this position. Notice that we've chased it around, we've gotten it all the way to b6, and it's in front of all of its pieces. So very, very exposed. Again, notice I can take this rook if I want. I could play bishop c5 check and then win the queen if I want. But in these kinds of king hunt positions where the king is out in the open, very exposed, I don't want to just win material. I want to try to go for checkmate. So I play a4. The idea is that if white gets another move, imagine black just makes a nothing move. Then we're going to play a5 check, and after the king moves to one of these light squares, we have queen e2 check. This is going to lead to checkmate in just a couple moves. So my opponent actually played bishop d7, so I went a5 check. After the king moved to b7, I played queen e2 checkmate. This is a really cool checkmate. The queen delivers check, cuts off the light squares. The bishop here cuts off these dark squares. The rook controls the a file, and the pawn on a5 controls the b6 square. All of these pieces work together to deliver this checkmate. Really, really cool checkmate. Instead, if my opponent had played a6, king a6, I would have played queen e2 check. Now after b5, we would take en passant, and the only two moves are king b7 and king b6. After king takes b6, we go queen a6. This is checkmate. And instead, if the king goes to b7, we again have queen a6 checkmate. The rook here defends the queen cuts off these light squares, and the bishop cuts off these dark squares. Another really cool checkmate where the pieces work together. I was really happy with how I played this game. I know my opponent was a little bit lower rated than I am, but nonetheless, I felt that I was very precise, especially in punishing my opponent's mistakes. That h6 move, I attacked the light squares very well, I felt. And I also was really pushing myself not just to look for moves that were good enough. You'll notice that, this rook on h8 is still hanging. I could have taken it multiple times, but I was trying to focus on the chess principle. If you see a good move, look for a better one. So I could have won material on multiple occasions, but I was going for checkmate. The king was out in the open, so I really wanted to just go for the win. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and also consider subscribing. In the meantime, there are some other videos that are going to pop up if you want to check them out.